If you've ever walked away from someone you cared about and felt both relief and a quiet ache at the same time, there's something important you should understand, something most men are never told. And before we get there, stay with me, because near the end of this conversation, I'll explain why walking away with dignity changes how you're remembered far more than anything you could say in the moment. If this kind of thoughtful perspective is helpful to you, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe, only if it genuinely earns that space for you. I'm speaking to you not as someone judging your choices, but as a psychologist who has listened to thousands of women describe moments like this in private, reflective settings. What I've learned is that when a man walks away calmly, without drama, without pleading, without bitterness, it creates an emotional imprint that is surprisingly deep, not because it's manipulative, not because it's a tactic, but because it disrupts expectations. Many men are taught that leaving means losing, that if you don't explain yourself perfectly, fight harder, or prove your worth one last time, you'll be forgotten. Yet emotionally, something very different often happens. When you walk away with dignity, you step out of a familiar script. And when a script breaks, the mind pays attention. What women often feel first is confusion, not the chaotic kind, but a quiet, unsettling pause. There's a moment where the nervous system realizes there is no chase, no explosion, no emotional mess to organize, just space. And space is uncomfortable when someone expected noise. That discomfort doesn't come from cruelty or ego. It comes from the human tendency to measure our impact through reaction. When you leave without trying to control how you're perceived, it subtly communicates self-trust. It says, "I know who I am, even if you don't choose me." That message lands emotionally before it's ever understood intellectually, and it often triggers reflection, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. Another feeling that quietly arises is respect. Not admiration in a romantic sense, not instant regret, but respect rooted in emotional maturity. Many women describe realizing, sometimes days or weeks later, that the man who left didn't try to win or punish. He simply chose himself. And that's rare enough to linger in memory. This doesn't mean every woman suddenly wants you back. That's not the point. The point is that dignity changes the emotional tone of the ending. It replaces chaos with meaning. And when meaning enters, people reflect. As we continue, I want to explore what happens beneath that reflection, why silence can speak louder than explanations, and why the way you leave often matters more than why you left. After the initial confusion settles, something more introspective often begins to unfold. When a man walks away with dignity, he removes the emotional mirror many people unconsciously rely on to understand themselves. There's no anger to react against, no desperation to feel powerful over, no argument to replay and justify. And in that absence, a woman is left alone with her own emotional experience. What many women privately describe is a subtle sense of being emotionally seen too late, not in the sense that you proved something after the fact, but in the realization that your calm departure suggested awareness of yourself, of the dynamic, of the limits of what could be given. That realization can be sobering. It introduces the idea that the relationship didn't end because you failed to convince or endure, but because you chose alignment over attachment. This is where self-questioning often begins. Not self-blame, but self-inquiry. What did he see that I didn't? Why wasn't chaos necessary for him to leave? Why didn't he try to reshape himself to stay? These questions don't arise from manipulation. They arise from contrast. Dignity contrasts sharply with the emotional bargaining that so many endings involve. There is also, very often, a delayed emotional wait. When a man doesn't collapse or retaliate, it denies the nervous system an immediate release. Emotions don't discharge through conflict. They linger, and lingering emotions are processed more deeply. This is why women often report thinking about a dignified departure far longer than a dramatic one. Drama resolves itself quickly. Calm endings echo. Another feeling that emerges is a quiet sense of safety, sometimes recognized only in hindsight. A man who can leave without cruelty or desperation signals emotional regulation. Even if the relationship wasn't right, that quality registers. It becomes part of how he's categorized internally, not as someone who needed to be escaped, but as someone who knew when to step away. It's important to say this clearly. None of this guarantees longing, regret, or reconciliation. Emotional maturity is not a bargaining chip, but it does tend to preserve something rare, psychological respect. And respect shapes memory. Long after emotions fade, respect remains a reference point for how someone felt in your presence. When women reflect on men who walked away with dignity, they often describe a sense of being gently confronted with their own agency. There was no villain to blame, no chaos to hide behind, just two people who reached the edge of what was possible. In the next part of this conversation, I want to explore why dignity is often misinterpreted in the moment and why its impact is almost always delayed, sometimes by weeks, sometimes by years. One of the most misunderstood aspects of walking away with dignity is that its impact is rarely immediate. In the moment, it can appear invisible. Sometimes it's even mistaken for indifference. And that misunderstanding is part of why so many men abandon dignity at the last moment, because they fear being emotionally erased. But psychologically, dignity works on a slower, deeper timeline. When a man doesn't chase, protest, or demand emotional reassurance, the nervous system doesn't register closure right away. Instead, it registers an unresolved pattern. And unresolved patterns are revisited by the mind, often repeatedly. Many women describe initially feeling emotionally untouched by a calm departure. They go on with their routines, tell themselves the ending was mutual or inevitable. But later, often during moments of quiet or when encountering emotional contrast with someone else, the memory resurfaces, not because of pain alone, but because of the unanswered question, why didn't he fight? That question is rarely about ego, it's about meaning. In most relationship endings, fighting is interpreted as proof of value. When that proof is absent, the mind has to construct a different explanation. And the explanation it often lands on is not that the man didn't care, but that he cared enough to respect himself. This is where perception subtly shifts. The absence of emotional chaos reframes the story. Instead of remembering a man who lost control, a woman remembers a man who knew his boundary. And boundaries are psychologically compelling because they imply self-knowledge. Another emotion that emerges over time is a kind of quiet humility. Not humiliation, but humility, the recognition that not all losses involve someone trying to win. For many women, this challenges a deeply ingrained relational expectation that if something mattered enough, someone would fight to the point of self-erasure. When that doesn't happen, it can gently destabilize that belief. There is also grief that unfolds differently. Dramatic endings allow grief to burn hot and fast. Dignified endings create a slow, reflective grief. It's less about what was said and more about what was understood without words. That kind of grief doesn't demand attention, but it deepens over time. And then there's comparison. Not conscious at first, but inevitable. When future relationships involve emotional volatility, pressure, or insecurity, the memory of a calm, respectful departure becomes a contrast point. It quietly raises the internal standard for emotional maturity. Again, this isn't about being remembered as perfect. It's about being remembered as grounded, as someone whose presence didn't require emotional management. In the next section, I want to talk about something rarely discussed: how walking away with dignity affects a woman's sense of choice, and why that matters more than regret ever could. When a man walks away with dignity, something subtle but profound happens to a woman's sense of choice. And this is one of the least talked about emotional effects because it's not dramatic and it doesn't show up in obvious ways. But psychologically, it matters deeply. In many relationship endings, choice becomes blurred. There's pressure, persuasion, emotional intensity, or conflict that pushes the nervous system into defense mode. Decisions are made reactively. Later, those decisions can be rationalized, minimized, or emotionally edited to protect the self-image. The story becomes, it had to end that way, or there was no other option. A dignified departure removes that protective fog. When you leave calmly without forcing an outcome, you leave the other person fully with their agency. There's no emotional force to push against, no behavior to justify resisting, and that clarity can be uncomfortable because it means the ending is felt as a choice, not as something that happened to them. Many women describe this as a delayed realization. I wasn't pushed, I wasn't cornered. He didn't make it impossible to stay. That realization can bring a quiet emotional weight because it removes the illusion of inevitability. The ending wasn't caused by chaos, it was shaped by compatibility, timing, or values. This doesn't automatically produce regret, but it often produces responsibility. And responsibility emotionally is heavier than blame. Blame can be projected outward. Responsibility has to be integrated. There's also a shift in how the man is remembered. Instead of being associated with pressure or emotional intensity, he becomes associated with freedom of choice. And paradoxically, freedom tends to increase psychological significance, not reduce it. We are more impacted by people who allow us to choose than by those who try to decide for us. Another feeling that sometimes arises is curiosity, not about what could have been said differently, but about what was understood silently. A calm exit suggests emotional literacy. It implies that the man recognized the limits of the connection without needing to dramatize them. That recognition can feel both relieving and confronting. Over time, this can influence how women evaluate future relationships. When someone pressures, over-explains, or refuses to accept an ending, it often feels heavier by comparison. The memory of dignity becomes a reference point, not as an idealized fantasy, but as an example of emotional respect. And for some women, there's a quiet moment of self-reflection that surfaces much later. The recognition that being chosen also means choosing well. That insight doesn't come from being chased. It comes from being trusted with the truth of someone else's self-respect. In the next part of this conversation, I want to explore why dignity is often felt as strength only after distance is created, and why trying to be understood in the moment usually weakens that impact. One of the hardest things for many men to accept is that being fully understood in the moment is rarely what creates emotional strength. In fact, the urge to explain yourself thoroughly to make sure the other person gets it often comes from anxiety, not clarity, and women tend to feel that difference even if they can't immediately articulate it. When you walk away with dignity, you allow distance to do the work that words cannot. Distance gives the nervous system time to settle. It removes emotional noise. And only then does perception sharpen. Many women later describe realizing that the man who didn't over-explain wasn't withholding. He was complete. He had already made sense of the situation internally. This can initially be unsettling. In the moment, a calm exit can feel emotionally flat, even anticlimactic. There's no final emotional exchange to anchor the ending, and without that anchor, the mind keeps returning to fill in the gaps. Not obsessively, but reflectively. What distance often reveals is that dignity reads as strength only once it's no longer present. While you're there, calm can be misread as emotional distance or detachment. Once you're gone, it's reinterpreted as self-possession. And that reinterpretation happens because absence removes ambiguity. There's no ongoing behavior to confuse the narrative. Another important emotional response that emerges with time is trust. Specifically, trust in your emotional authenticity. Women often report realizing that a man who left without emotional theatrics wasn't trying to manage their reaction. He wasn't trying to be seen as the good guy or the wronged one. He simply acted in alignment with himself. That kind of alignment is deeply stabilizing to witness, even after the fact. It suggests an internal compass that doesn't depend on external validation. And while that may not always feel romantic in the moment, it feels grounded in retrospect. There's also a subtle relief that can surface. Not relief that the relationship ended, but relief that it ended cleanly, without emotional residue that needs to be resolved, defended, or reinterpreted. Many women describe appreciating this only later, once they've experienced endings that were far more emotionally draining. Trying to be understood immediately often leads men to say things they later wish they hadn't, not because the feelings were wrong, but because the timing was driven by fear of being misremembered. Ironically, that fear is what often distorts memory. Dignity, on the other hand, leaves room for emotional processing to mature. It allows the story to settle into something honest and proportional rather than something reactive. In the next and final section, I want to share what many women realize only much later, sometimes years later, about men who walked away with dignity, and why that realization is the quiet reveal I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. As time passes, something even deeper tends to form around the memory of a man who walked away with dignity. The emotional charge fades, the specifics blur, but the impression remains. And that impression is not about what he demanded or what he lost. It's about who he was when things no longer worked. Many women describe reaching a stage where they no longer replay the relationship itself, but they do remember how it ended. Not with sharp clarity, but with a quiet emotional tone. And dignity has a tone. It feels steady, it feels composed, it feels adult. Long after passion, disappointment, or confusion dissolve, that tone becomes the final emotional summary. This is where something important happens internally. A dignified departure often becomes integrated into a woman's understanding of what emotional masculinity can look like. Not dominance, not emotional withdrawal, but self-respect without hostility. And once that internal reference exists, it subtly reshapes expectations. This doesn't mean she consciously compares every future partner to you. It's more subtle than that. It shows up as discomfort with men who beg, pressure, collapse, or attempt to control outcomes through intensity. It shows up as an appreciation for emotional clarity, even when it's disappointing. The standard shifts, not upward in fantasy, but inward in realism. There is also, at times, a delayed gratitude, not for the loss, but for the way the loss was handled. Many women say they didn't realize how rare it was until later, until they experienced endings that were far more confusing, draining, or destabilizing. Only then does the calm ending stand out as something that protected both people. And here's something rarely acknowledged. Dignity allows a woman to keep her own integrity intact as well. Because she wasn't pulled into emotional combat, she doesn't have to rewrite the past to defend herself. The memory doesn't need to be distorted to make sense. It can remain honest. Over time, this honesty creates emotional peace. And emotional peace is often associated with the person who made it possible, even if that person is no longer present. This is why walking away with dignity is not about being admired, missed, or reconsidered. It's about becoming part of someone's emotional education. You become a reference point for what it feels like when a man knows himself well enough to leave without trying to take anything with him. In the final part of this conversation, I want to bring everything together. I want to explain the quiet truth that many women only recognize much later, and why walking away with dignity isn't something you do for how it affects them, but for who it allows you to become.